for Krysciak to be joining us today and talking to us about his lessons learned through competitive angling.
More about kind of honing your existing techniques and hopefully getting a few fish in the net, a few more fish in the net. So this is kind of how I'm going to lay it out tonight. So 3 different parts. First part is just going to be talking about just that. So not talking about technique, not talking about patterns or anything. It's you're going fishing, you do the exact same thing that you're already doing. It's just how can you do it better, more efficiently, get more fish to hand. Part 2, we'll be talking about actually patterning fish a little bit more effectively. So instead of just, hoping that you stumble into a pattern, how you would more sort of strategically show up to maybe a river that maybe a lake that you don't know, starting from scratch or starting from some kind of basis of understanding, and then dialing things in and adapting at the same time too. And then part 3 would be, I think, the least important, but it's some interesting stuff that we could talk about a little bit about, just because we are in an urban environment and it is something we deal with a lot in competitive fishing, is adapting to pressure and how that's going to change fish as well. So yeah. Part 1, do what you're doing already, but do it better. So what I'm talking about here is, again, you show up to the river, and whether you nymph, you dry fly fish, streamer fish, whatever, small tweaks that you can make just to be a little more efficient, make more casts in a day, cover more spots. And so preparation can come in a lot of different forms. You're talking about organization, trip planning, thinking about access points, thinking about time of year, all that. Keeping fit would be a big thing. Anything like that, practicing casting. But where I would really start from is just a very, very much a ground level. And, making sure that you have what you need every day that you go out. And so I can't count the number of times that I see an angler be out there and they'll ask you what's working. You tell them, oh, X is working, nymphing's working, fishing this size of line, whatever. And they say, oh, that's cool, I don't have that. What else can you offer me? And so, what it comes down to is you don't need to be prepared for every single scenario, but make sure you have what you need to cover any different scenario that you think you're going to be faced. And so it starts off with the big things, and I like to keep a checklist, might be like river trout or dry fly fishing river trout. Have that checklist. And so what's in your dry fly kit? Okay, well, it's this model of rod that I like. It's this reel with this line. It's this line. It's this leader. It's, leader floatant, fly floatant, these flies. And then that's your kit for dry fly fishing. And nymphing is a different one. Bass is a different one, because it's those small things that'll really throw you off. If you get out there and you've got, your 5-weight and you're nymphing for most of the day, but dry flies come off. You've got your dry flies, but you forgot your nylon tippet or you forgot your float. And that's what will really screw you up. And that's lost opportunities. Some of that comes down to restocking as well and keeping track of what you're running through. So that could be flies, but leader and tippet always screw people over, right? You get to the river and you pull out that last length of tippet. Some people call that bad luck. I call it bad preparation, which is leading to bad luck. I always have a spare, fresh spool of every size of tippet that I'm going to use on the river. If you're in a competition and you run out of a size of tippet that's working, you are screwed. That can be a competition ender. And then storing equipment in consistent places too. So don't just have, a garage filled with a bunch of gear. Make sure that you've got like a pack that has all your trout stuff and a pack that has your bass stuff, ideally. Fitness sounds intense, but it's not necessarily. I find as well, a lot of people lose fishing hours because they aren't able to stay on the water as long as they could or want to. And so that starts with dressing appropriately so that you don't get uncomfortable out there. But then also hydration, I think, is really overlooked by a lot of anglers. It's not, just a small water bottle on a hot day. It's like a very large Nalgene. And I will pump that with electrolyte tablets as well, especially in competition, but even just fun fishing around here. Like, it can be really draining, and you find by the afternoon you aren't as sharp as you were in the morning. Good, but then nutritionally, protein is really important for us when we're doing competitions. So it used to be that you'd rely on you'd have like a sugary snack or something you could tuck into a pocket, and if you need a little hit, you could you bring like a protein shake, like an Ensure or something, and just at lunch pound that back, and the protein will just help your focus. It'll keep you a little bit more dialed in. And then the clothing thing, dressing properly. Steel headers lose I don't know how many hours because they tap out. You're out there on a cold day, hands get cold, feet get cold, that kind of stuff. So past that, on the water efficiency makes a big difference too. And so a big takeaway for me is my first worlds I competed at last year. My biggest takeaway from that, seeing some really talented anglers compete, was how much more fishing time they were getting in than certainly myself. And I think a few of the other guys on the team as well had this realization, like, we are fishing less than them. And so what I mean by that is that, as an example, we would watch our Spanish guide, who's every bit as good, I would say, is 99% of the anglers there at World. And, he'd be teaching us and showing us where to put a cast. Like, okay, the fish is going to live in this kind of water, and you need to make this cast to make it. And he'd make it on the first go. And it'd be a tough cast, like a long, 20-ish foot leader at 40 feet, 50 feet, tucking it under a little branch, something like a tough cast. And these were super technical fish. So that was another level than we're usually faced with. But then we would get up and try and make the same cast. And we'd make it, but it might take like 4, 5, 6 casts to make it, which, based on the difficulty, we weren't totally ashamed of. But you start to put it together and, like, okay, the time that it took them to make that cast, and it took me that long. Like, well, for one, your best cast is always the first one you make to a spot, because you're not likely to spook the fish and all that. So it's always better to nail it first to start. But from a time perspective, in a 3 or 4 hour session that we had fishing at competition, as an example, the best anglers are making every cast count. They fish a full 4 hour session, where us fiddling around trying to make that cast, I bet you we're fishing half the time that they are. But then you realize that if you can just be more efficient with your movements on the water, you can actually fish longer than another person on the same day. So that boils down to a few things here. You cast more than anything else, practice it more than anything, right? That is what you're going to spend. Of all the different tasks that you have to do in a day, not tying and searching for gear, moving around and stuff, you're casting more than anything else. And so really, I cannot emphasize enough casting. I can't offer tailored advice for every scenario casting, other than practice it. Practice casting weird scenarios. One of my favorite little drills when I was, I still do it, but like, especially when I was starting off, like really practicing casting, is I would go to a local school field, and they had a lot of like little sapling trees planted out there, sort of in random patterns. And I would go stand in the middle of them and pick a target like between the trees and try and make a back cast between some other trees and like tuck it under and work around objects and stuff. I found that really helped, just getting to be more creative with your casting and learn to work with, to practice your casting, however that looks, whatever that means. Maybe if you're a saltwater angler, it's more just distance and you don't have to worry about obstructions. If you're a trout angler, it's probably more dealing in tight quarters and landing things where you want, and delicacy and all that. But really practice your casting, because that will make for a longer day of fishing. Minimize false casting. Everyone's heard that, but I still see like most anglers false cast way too much. You look at the best anglers, it's like 1 or 0 false casts for most casts. And again, you'd think, 0 false casts is just boom, boom, and you're out there, versus 1 false cast, it takes twice as long. Learn 3 knots really well. I think anglers, especially fly anglers, get really caught up in knot tying. I think it's cool. It's, the Boy Scout thing to do, to know a whole whack of knots. It's cool. You need a knot that you can attach leader to your fly line, that you can attach line to line, and that you can attach a fly with. And, if you like loop knot, maybe you'll learn a 4th knot, but practice the hell out of them. A few knots that I like a clinch knot a lot. I like a double or like a triple surgeon's knot a lot. I like a Davy knot, and I like a uni knot. Practice your knots a lot until they're automatic. It'll just make you a better angler out there. Pay attention to ergonomics of your pack. That's less important, I would say, when we're looking for small edges and competitive fishing and trying to, just again, really magnify how many casts we can make in a session. We're caring about how easy it is to get to things. I would encourage you to take a quick look at, but it's not as imperative because this is costing you seconds a day. My nippers, I know, are up on my left shoulder because when I tie a knot and finish it, right hand goes to here. It's very close. I'm not going down to my side or in any kind of awkward position. Same thing, fly box, very easy to reach spot. Floatant is usually up on my chest, so it's just a dip and smudge on my fly. Relying on a game plan to minimize on water decision making. So this is a little bit more of a nuanced one, but I think it can also help with mental fatigue. So a lot of the time you'll get out to a river or water body, whatever you're fishing, and things might not be going exactly as planned. Or maybe you just have a short window. You know that you have to change something, or in the case of a short time window, you just know that you have to really pattern things out very quickly to make the most of your time in the water. If you can make a plan with maybe just like 3 or 4 steps, it's going to allow you to be a little bit more automatic on the water and really focus on getting your presentation down and observing other changes instead of thinking about all that stuff while you're fishing. And where it comes into mental fatigue is that if you're on the water and things aren't going exactly as planned, you start racking your brain, you get frustrated, and it's harder to think clearly. And so in a competition, sometimes we'll even write out on a small piece of paper exactly our predetermined process for how we're going to try things and try and find a pattern. I'll use the same kind of game plan idea. Okay, I mean, you heard me say it there. I'm going to start with maybe a small fly because it's low water, but with a little hot spot just to try that. Then I'm going to go to a more downsized or more drab fly and maybe throw in a couple dries. And my working box, all that means is a completely blank box with, I'll put like 6 flies in, maybe a duplicate of each fly. And so when I get to the river, I'm not searching through a box with 1,000 flies. I'm searching through 6 flies. I've made an educated guess are probably going to work given the time of year and the conditions. And the last thing would be use a watch to pace yourself, or just keep an eye on the clock, because I think we all also get stuck in places sometimes. Keep moving, keep flexible, and that could be a fly change thing too. This could be less about moving spots and more about changing presentation or changing tactic too. So don't waste shots. This kind of comes back to a bit of what we were talking about. Every day you go out you're gonna have a set of opportunities that you can capitalize on. Some days more than others. Some days the fish are gonna be on, some they're gonna be off. The best anglers in the world make the most of those opportunities. Sounds really simple. So what it comes down to is basically just being ready and in the moment when those opportunities arise. But always have control of your line to start. So you see a lot of people. My favorite is this move. They'll go for a big cast, and they'll cast, and they want to shoot line, and they let go of all their line. And then they regather their line and get ready to fish. And sometimes you'll see it for like 5-6 seconds. That might be an exaggeration. Reaching, grabbing for their line, trying to find it, get control. Starts with your cast. And when I talk about have control of your line, when you cast, if you go shoot line, even if you don't shoot line, never drop your line. So you go and you shoot for distance and you let that line run through a ring in your fingers. So you shoot, still having control of my line. If you imagine it's shooting through that ring of my fingers, and when I hit my shot, you got it, tucking out of my stripping finger, I'm there. And so having that line just run through your fingers, having control from the get-go, you can set that up. You can have control. You can start stripping right away, whatever it is. Never drop your line. Always have control of your line throughout the retreat. Be ready for a strike. Sounds super basic. Rivers are, some people would say they're like meditative places and, a place to get lost, whatever. That's cool. Just realize you're going to miss fish. You want to be, as soon as you make a cast, you're thinking, watch that fly, watch the line, watch the water, watch behind the fly. Be observant, be ready for that strike every time. And if you're retrieving, so say if you're fishing like a streamer on a sinking line, maybe bass or something, or stillwater trout, and you're retrieving your fly, don't just fall into a pattern of I'm just retrieving blindly. If you can, actually try and visualize your fly swimming through the water. Imagine, okay, I'm doing like figure of 8 retrieve. It fly's going like this through the water. And if I was a fish following that fly, what would turn me on? Or maybe a little speed up. So a couple quick pulls and back to regular pace. Maybe just pause it. The more that you can think about what the fish is actually seeing and what you're doing with the fly, not just blindly falling into routine, guarantee you'll result in more fish. The other thing that will do is the more that you're expecting fish, the more good hook sets you're going to make. Have a plan for how you're going to get the fish out of the log. Don't be worried about losing it, because you have to hook it first to be able to worry about losing it. So make the shot and, deal with landing it after, but have some kind of an idea of your first move. And that'll help you get on the fish a little quicker and put the fight in your terms. Look before you lift. This one really comes from stillwater stuff, but definitely applies in rivers too. When you go to lift your flies out of the water, don't be in a rush to lift them out. Make sure you can clearly see your flies and behind the flies. You talk about musky anglers who figure eight for musky. It's the same thing. They don't just blindly lift the fish lure out of the water, because those fish follow so often. They're going to keep the flies wet, make sure nothing's following, and then they'll lift them. Have a rising fish. There's a saying, I believe the Czechs have: a rising fish is a dead fish. So they're so confident in their ability that if they see a rising fish, like that is a catchable feeding fish that I've seen before they've seen me. I have no good reason to not catch that fish now. So never don't cover rising fish, especially in lakes, like bass fishing. If you see surface activity, if you see minnows blowing up, if you see something splash middle of the lake, you might want to check that area out. It could be something chasing school bait in the middle of the lake. Just be observant, take that stuff in. Don't hook more, land more. There's another good quote. I can't remember who it's from, but it's a British competitive angler, I believe, who somebody asked him one day how he catches more fish in every session, in every competition than everybody else. He's like, oh, well, I don't catch more, I just land more. So it's a very overlooked skill, I think, is landing fish and fighting fish properly. I think a lot of people could probably up their catch rates 10, 20, 30, 40%. I would bet you, like just focusing on how they fight fish. This is where the show and tell thing was going to come in, where I actually had a little demo I was going to give. So you always need pressure on fish, especially with a barbless hook. Otherwise, chances are that hook's going to work its way out. But really, talking about pressure, again, we're told to keep things tight. And some of that's angler ability, some of it's rod ability. But I think what's overlooked a lot of the time is the angle. And so I did have a rod here. A lot of people are told tip up and keep that thing up. And I think the reason that they do that is because it's very easy to visualize just how high the tip is, and if it's bent, if the rod's bent, and if you have tension on the fish. The trouble is this does nothing to put really good leverage on a fish. This is the worst angle to fight any fish on. I don't care what fish it is, it's not a good angle. The way that you can land a fish quickly is by getting side pressure on it. So fish can only swim where their head is pointed. And so if we can control which direction the head's pointed, you control which direction they go. Say that the line and the fish is going straight out for me, okay? That's the basis that we're starting from. And I have that rod point out to the side, so it's forming like between the rod to the line a 90-degree angle. That's okay. You have some side pressure then, but where it actually really starts to take effect is when this goes past 90 degrees, okay? A little more open than 90 degrees, call it 100, 110. When it's actually facing in a river back to the bank, okay? Once you have that angle, it's amazing the difference in the amount of pressure that this actually puts on the rod, and you'll notice that you can start steering a fish. Yeah. Kind of hard to believe until you actually try it, but this is the right angle to fight a fish on, whether that's up or downstream. However, I will say I much prefer fighting fish on an upstream angle. I find when my rod is pointing upstream, even if the fish is downstream of me, I get more leverage, and I don't pop hooks out of fish as often. So my initial move when I'm fighting a fish, or start from the hooking side of things, you're fishing along, whatever, okay, hook set, downstream hook set always in a river because fish face upstream, you don't want to yank it back out of their mouth. Obviously, you're fishing wet flies or fishing streamers downstream, and you kind of got to deal with maybe you don't hook every fish because you got that not awesome hooking angle. But it is what it is. In that case, you try and get side pressure, like back to the bank, so that you can kind of cross their face. But dry flies, nymphs, whatever, you're generally coming downstream with it. So you set downstream against the grain. From there, you want to get this rod to the upstream as quick as you can. So it's set downstream and just very smoothly but quickly to the upstream right away. And then what you want to do is get this rod really low. So I would always say like horizontal is where you want this. The trouble is this feels horizontal in the heat of the moment when you're fighting a fish. And when you're dealing with a 9-foot rod at this angle, that rod tip actually ends up quite high in the air and it's very high up above the fish. And so again, it's not really pulling the fish to the side, it's just pulling its head upwards and not really controlling the direction of the fish. So what you almost need to do, I find sometimes, is tell yourself that you're going to almost put the tip of the rod in the water as you're fighting this fish. And at that point, you know that you're parallel to the water, you're horizontal, you're flat. And then you got to tilt that rod back to the bank. At that point, it's basically that move for the whole fight. Even if a fish gets downstream of you, I try and keep the angle to my upstream. I might walk downstream a bit. Be surprised how often you can keep a fish in front of you. And then once it's fought out, and it doesn't take as long as you think once you have this angle, you get the fish starts coming upstream on you because you're pulling it upstream and across, and it starts coming in front of you just straight upstream. You're going to keep changing this angle, pulling further and further toward the bank until the fish is directly upstream of you. And then you want to go for the final catch. You get down low to the water so you don't have to pull it upwards. You pull it back. You get low to the water in a crouch. You get your net extended and you pull straight back over your head. So the fish was upstream. You pull its head now back over itself right into your net. Don't be afraid to bend that rod a bit. Keep the bend toward the middle section of the rod, not the tip. You don't want the rod like candy caned over on itself. Like if it's bent right over on itself on the thinnest, weakest part of the blank, that's how you break a rod. But if it's bent, in the mid part of the rod, you can bend them really, really, really deep before you actually break a fish, especially if you have your drag set accordingly so that it's not going to blow up. That drag should dispense before you have a break off. Yeah, and that's mostly what I have for fish. Keep that rod really low. Keep good tension on it. Use appropriate gear for the size of fly that you're fishing. And don't be afraid to really lean into them. And don't be too anxious to chase fish. In rivers, I see a lot of people start moving downstream with the fish way, way too early. The only time that you should do that is if you're actually beat by the fish. If I'm standing in a pool and I've got like a little rapidy stretch below me, I won't budge from my spot until I know that that fish is actually in the rapids and it's actually run me through and I can't physically bring it back up through those rapids. That's the point that you chase it downstream. You don't have to get downstream of it right away. That movement, bouncing around with your rod and stuff, there's way too much bad stuff that can happen between the time that you hook that fish and during the fight. You'll most likely land lose most of those fish. And there is one little trick. I don't know how critical it is, but it's a cool trick, and so I think people should know it. I've used it a handful of times. But if a fish ever does really beat you downstream, especially if there's not too many snags in the water, what you can do to bring it back up to you without chasing it a mile downstream, it works a good percentage of the time. Take your rod, stick the tip of it in the water so your whole line gets submerged. Put steady pressure on it, but you're not pumping the rod, just a slight, a nice bend in the rod, and then just smoothly start reeling. And don't stop. Don't be jerky about anything. Don't pump the rod, nothing. Tip down in the water. The line in the water creates a ton of friction on the water. It actually adds a lot of pressure to the fish. And I think the smoothness at which they get drawn back up through the current almost kind of hypnotizes them. Like they don't really realize that they're going for a ride. And I've brought steelhead back upstream on like 3-4X line. So have a curious mind, be observant. So I think the best anglers are the ones who aren't, like a lot of the time they're the newest ones for one, and they're the ones who aren't afraid to bend rules a little bit and go their own way. Now that's within reason. I think people should generally start with a pretty decent base of like, I understand the principles of, the fish that I'm targeting and what's already been learned about them, because any major game fish, we've probably got 100 years of fishing experience for them. And we kind of know their ins and outs to some, it's written somewhere, it's recorded in a video. But once you have a little bit of a base level of knowledge, don't be afraid to like tinker and try weird things. That's generally how the best techniques are created. This is a very cool spot in Spain last year where I was right in town. And I don't know how many fish you can actually count on that, but it's just littered. Walking up and down this wall, this high wall, we were able to just spot them and see their behavior and stuff. This was actually a really tough beat for people who drew it. This was actually in the competition. I don't think it was coughing up more than maybe 8-10 fish a session kind of thing, but it was like this all the way through, just stacked fish. Again, there are no rules in fishing. I find a lot of people who take fishing the quickest and have the most success are the ones who are willing to bend rules a little bit and try new stuff and are afraid to think outside the box. Yeah, just muck around and don't be afraid to bring different techniques together. Things. And then the more, potentially even the more important one, just be observant. And maybe I should have crammed these into the same slide, but to pattern well, and you'll see it in this next chapter, we're going to talk about how you want pattern fish. You need to be able to take note of a lot of different variables happening around you at once. Part B is going to be pattern breaking. So, yeah, this is top of everybody's mind when they go out. What fly should I be using? Where are the fish going to be? That kind of good stuff. And so when you think about it, there are kind of 4 factors that are going to affect fish behavior. One's food. Fish need food to survive. They're burning calories all day, swimming in water. They need food. This is their primary driver. They will leave comfortable cover. They will leave comfortable water temperatures. They will put themselves in danger to get food because they have to. Food is always the #1 driver. Let's pay attention to it. First thing, you want to understand the relative or relevant food sources for the time of year. So again, that's going to vastly vary depending on body of water that you're in, the bugs or forage bait that's available, what those fish are looking at. But if it's trout, you probably want to understand the bugs and what's going to be around that time of year. If it's bass, you want to understand, okay, is this lake shad? Is it perch? Because those are going to behave very differently. And then start to learn about where that food is found. So learn that a brown drake is a burrowing nymph that lives in slow, mucky water. And so if you want to find fish feeding on them, you're looking for slow, mucky, or not mucky water, but mucky bottoms. Versus, okay, Hendrickson's, I'm looking at clinging crawling, I can never remember, but that lives in riffly water with, some boulders and stuff that can live under. Very different situations for where you're going to find the food. So you might fish very different flies depending on where you are. The more you can understand about food, the more that you can understand the most important driver of the fish and where they're going to be. Number 2 is temperature. And as it relates to oxygen, we talked a lot about safe fishing temperatures for trout. A lot of that's due to oxygen content in water and how quickly they're able to recover. It's not just a trout thing. All fish have a comfortable temperature range. You hear people talk about warm water fish. They like warm water. You hear people talk about cold water fish and cool water fish. And temperature will be a big driver of location, but also mood and activity level of the fish. And if you have big changes, temperature is somewhat relative. Pay attention to temperature, learn the species that you're fishing for, what its preferred range is and how it reacts to water temperatures, and then use that to inform a decision. What I will do is, I know I'm going fishing on Saturday. I'm going to look at the weather every day, Thursday, Friday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whatever, and see how things change. It might be a beautiful day, 25 and sunny on Saturday, but if it was 30 degrees through the week and then you had a thunderstorm on Friday, 25 and sunny is a cold front. And, whereas in the spring, fish would be on, that could be death on the Saturday where it's a cold front. And so that helps you set expectations as well. And the more information that you can go in with and set your expectations, you have an idea like, if fish are going to be a little slower, I'm going to work through my my game plan, my strategy for that day slower. If I get to the river and I don't catch a fish in 5 minutes, I'm not going to race off and change another fly. I just have it in my head. It's going to be tougher. I'm going to be more methodical about how I fish. My pacing, am I changing? So look at relative changes in temperature and pressure. We go along with that. Cover. Fish need to be safe. There's tons of predators out there. Fish need cover. Don't overlook things that aren't traditionally associated with cover. So lily pads are cover, a log is cover, an undercut bank is cover. So is depth, right? Deeper something is, harder it is for you to see it or a bird to see it. So, if you have a deep pool, why do fish rest there? Well, because they have cover. Fast water is cover. So I talk about this time of year, if I was to hit credit tomorrow, I'd probably target pocket water and riffles. It's because that's an area where you can find food, but also because the fish is actually probably better camouflaged and better covered under broken water, because you can't see in that stuff very well, neither can a bird, than it is in a slow, glassy pool that's a little bit low and clear this time of year. Fish will use broken water as cover just as much as they will anything else. So anything that conceals a fish, don't overlook that as cover. So where early morning hours, low light, those fish were very comfortable in shallow water. Suddenly you get high sun, that water is not safe anymore. It's not covered. Those fish retreat into other places. Pay attention, obviously, like water levels and comfortable spots for those fish to hold into. And then pressure. So, always account for the amount of pressure that those fish are seeing when you're accounting for fish behavior, both in their activity level and their location. So yeah, try and take note of every one of them and just build that theoretical plan in the back of your mind. And then as things change through the day, you can adjust as well, right? So again, if you know that Hendrickson's hatch midday, mid to, more like mid-afternoon, maybe I don't think about them so much until mid-afternoon. And then I start changing about where the fish move, because fish will move. There'll be little mini migrations that'll happen through a day, right? So every single change that you noticed when we were talking about being more observant, you roll that back into these 4 factors and ask yourself how it's going to impact. So that's temperature, light level, every little change, okay? So activity level is like the biggest thing, I would think. Activity and fish density. It basically, those two things, having a rough understanding of how many fish are in a spot and how active they should be, will help you adapt your pattern and set expectations for the day. So if I'm on the Grand and I know that they just stocked 30,000 fish, and every obvious pool is going to be loaded with a whole bunch of fish, if I go through there and don't almost immediately hook a fish, I can almost instantly, within 10 minutes, start changing things and start working on a new pattern, because the fish are there. And if they were just stocked and they've had a minute to settle in, they should be feeding pretty actively, unless there's some wacky weather event. Whereas if I go to the Grand before they stock it and it's only holdover fish, and there's only a few good sized fish per pool kind of thing, I will go there and I will work that for maybe an hour or two before I think about changing anything, I think. And spookiness, again, it also plays into that. So like, okay, I know these fish are extremely picky because they get pressured a lot. I can't necessarily blame my fly or blame my technique. I just need to realize that I might need to adjust for the spookiness and how long I'm casting, how softly I'm waiting, how many casts I need to make to a specific fish. All this comes down to just setting expectations and determining the pace that you fish at. So yeah, and this is really the last part of it. So if a fish feels pressure, a lot of the time, the way that they feel that pressure isn't being hooked and caught, it's being trampled. So you get a lot of people on busy rivers that wade through areas. It can be kind of annoying, but it's, reality of being around here. And so when that happens, a fish notices it very quickly and it moves if it feels threatened by that activity. And so sometimes the best thing to do when you feel like you're fishing pressured water is to look at unconventional places. And so a lot of the time what will happen with trout and rivers is they push to the sides and they push to kind of what we would call like B grade spots. So, you see the big pool, you see the really juicy looking pocket, and a lot of time they aren't there. Instead, they're like at the head of the pool, kind of tucked up, or like they're at a little like secondary drop off the back of the pool. And then on the extreme side, if they really get pressured, they'll push into really skinny water sometimes. Like surprisingly, like, why are you here, water? Because it's the last remaining stuff for them to be able to exist in. So don't be afraid to like just fish slower, be observant, watch for fish, because they'll show themselves a lot of time with a little rise or a little flash here and there. You'll think, am I seeing things? And no, sometimes it is just fish. They ended up in a weird spot because they got trampled on. A lot of my favorite spots, I'll say on the Grand, credit to an extent. Definitely the Grand are like not the big pools. They're like the little tailouts or the little pockets right adjacent to a pool, because everybody stands there and flogs the pool all day and the fish just feel better moving, 50 feet to the side in this, what would otherwise be an attractive piece of water. It's just that we look over it because there's this giant pool in front of us. So location, that's the first thing I look at when I think pressure. Past that, just how you approach the water and stealthiness. You watch like the Europeans, and a lot of them are like smaller frames, and so we actually get a little jealous because they're like so light they can like bounce on the rocks and like walk in the water, float on the water, as Ian says, and they just move around so stealthily. We've got to be a little more careful sometimes, but you don't want to go barging into a river, obviously, anytime, but especially when they get pressured. Think about not just like how softly you step, but the course that you take in the river. So am I walking upstream or downstream? That gets covered lots. Walking upstream doesn't kick dirt in their faces, whatever. It's less likely that those sound waves are going to transfer upstream through the current to the fish versus downstream. Before I muck around with fly pattern too much and getting like super imitative or like going to an all, matte black fly or something totally off the chart stealthy, I would think about your tippet size and your fly size in that order as well. Tippet would be first, and tippet, it's not because fish are going to see the tippet. If tippet size drastically affects how the fly drifts, how it fishes, whether it's a streamer or a nymph or a dry fly. If you can go smaller on the tippet, it's going to be limper and it's going to let the fly behave more naturally. If you think you've got like a stiff, like a springy piece of like wire tied to a fly, and you set in the river, the little currents can't like move the fly or anything. It's like locked in, right? So that's your thick tippet, right? It's like stuck there. It can't move freely. Thin tippet is like a little wispy, fairy string. It lets that fly just drift around, do whatever it wants. That's the reason for thin tippet working so well. It's not in my opinion, it's not the diameter within reason. Like I'm talking, you're starting at 5x, you're going down to 6x. It's not because it's thinner and the fish could see the 5x and they don't care about the 6. They could probably see both. It's the way that the fly behaves because of it. And then I would consider fly size. And so fly size, usually it's just stepping down as the pressure gets worse. I put that before fly pattern because what you'll actually often find is you can fish, you got a little fly with a hot spot that's working, but after that water's beat up a little, they can't turn off it. Go 1-2 sizes smaller, it'll turn right back on. Or do the same with the tippet. And that's usually the order that we go with in competitions is day 1, you fish whatever, and you find a pattern that's working. Day 2, you actually, even if you're fishing behind another angler who's already beat that water up a bit, you don't necessarily go to the uber stealthy, supernatural, delicate stuff. You probably just downsize what was working on day 1. Almost always. Even not just bugs. I'm talking streamers and stuff too. You just downsize. And a lot of the time that'll hold true and still work. And then finally, on the most extreme side, you start changing pattern and going to things that are a little bit more natural. But I often find that that's where fly anglers start, is to go to the fly pattern. Okay, I'm not catching on this bigger hare's ear. I go to like a tiny little, size 24 Baetis thing on FX, and that's going to change the day. It's usually not it. It's usually first location. Then did you spook the fish with how you weight it in? Then is the fly drifting naturally? And finally, the fly pattern. And where I think people really get in trouble is the flies that usually catch the most fish. Like we talk about, you have unpressured fish, you can rack them up by using a little fly with a little hot spot or something, a little color to it, a little flash, a gold bead, whatever. The reason you're catching more fish on that is because they can see it, they can track it better, and fish are naturally curious and programmed to eat things that look different than natural sticks and stones. If you jump straight to the last step and start fishing super drab stuff that looks like sticks and stones, you'll actually start catching less fish. The only time that works better is when the fish are that badly pressured that they are totally spooked off of any color. But that point is way further down the road than people give it credit for.
Totally.
Yeah. Cool. Great. That's all I got.